They said the gala would be a night of elegance, a place where fortunes glittered as brightly as the chandeliers. But no one expected the moment when laughter froze, music died, and an heiress's jeweled hand struck across the face of a young black woman. In that instant, the entire ballroom turned to stone, and when the billionaire father walked in, the room learned that power and money could not silence the truth. The chandeliers shimmered like constellations across the ceiling of the Davenport Grand, each crystal drop catching the glow of gold-plated light. The ballroom pulsed with the hum of violins, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the rehearsed laughter of the rich. This was more than a social event. It was a theater of power, where every smile was a performance and every handshake a negotiation. Tonight, money wasn't just present. It was paraded like a crown jewel. Into this glittering masquerade walked Naomi Carter. Her gown wasn't designer, but it was carefully chosen. A navy blue satin dress she had saved for months to buy, pressed until it carried the weight of her pride. Naomi wasn't here as a guest, nor as one of the society figures who floated from conversation to conversation. She was here as a junior curator, tasked with ensuring the priceless artworks on display were respected. For her, this evening was more than work. It was a chance to prove herself, to be seen in a space where people like her were rarely acknowledged, let alone welcomed. Naomi carried herself with quiet grace. Her mother had taught her that dignity wasn't about wealth, but about how you stood when others tried to make you feel small. So when her heels touched the marble floor, she moved with her head high, her gaze steady, as though she belonged every bit as much as those draped in diamonds. But not everyone in the room agreed. From across the ballroom, Charlotte Davenport watched Naomi with disdain carved into her perfect features. Charlotte was the only daughter of Gregory Davenport, the billionaire whose real estate empire towered over Manhattan, like monuments to his ambition. Born into privilege, Charlotte had never been told no. She was used to doors opening, to whispers following her, to people shrinking under the weight of her name. And tonight, she decided Naomi Carter didn't belong. Charlotte approached like a queen inspecting her kingdom, her entourage of jeweled friends trailing behind her like a shadow. She stopped just feet from Naomi, her eyes flicking over the young woman's dress with a smirk sharp enough to cut. "This section is reserved for guests," Charlotte said, her voice honeyed with mockery. "Staff shouldn't be standing here like they belong." Naomi turned slowly, her hand still resting on the display she had been adjusting. She met Charlotte's gaze without flinching, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to ensure the exhibition remains in order. This piece is one of the highlights of the evening." Charlotte's laugh was soft, but it dripped with venom. "Highlights," she repeated, glancing at her friends who tittered on cue. "Darling, the highlight of this gala isn't some dusty canvas, it's me. People are here to see my father's legacy, and by extension, me. Not the staff." The words were meant to humiliate, to remind Naomi that she was an outsider in a room stitched together by privilege. But Naomi didn't falter. "Without the art, there would be no gala," she said, her voice steady, her dignity intact. "Everyone here is standing because of it." The defiance in Naomi's tone ignited something wild in Charlotte. Her lips curled, her pride wounded before her audience of friends. With a sudden violent motion, Charlotte's hand rose and cracked against Naomi's cheek. The sound echoed through the ballroom, louder than the orchestra, sharper than the clinking of crystal. A gasp tore through the crowd. Music faltered. Conversations froze. All at once, hundreds of eyes turned toward the two women locked in that moment, one with fury blazing in her eyes, the other with dignity burning brighter than humiliation. Naomi staggered, her cheek burning from the sting. Her breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stand tall. Tears threatened to well, but she swallowed them down. She had promised herself long ago that no one, not even the wealthy heirs of billionaires, would strip her of her pride. Charlotte smirked, savoring the attention, mistaking fear for power. "Remember your place," she hissed, her words like venom dripping into the silence. "People like you serve. People like me shine." The circle of onlookers held their breath. Some were horrified, others amused, but none dared to intervene. Naomi felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. But when she finally spoke, her voice cut through the hush like a blade. "You may have wealth," she said, her tone calm, her eyes never leaving Charlotte's. "But respect is something money can't buy. Tonight, you've shown the world how little of it you truly have." The words rippled through the ballroom, bold and unshaken. Charlotte's smile faltered, anger seething beneath her skin. She raised her hand again, ready to strike, when the air shifted. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a force that demanded attention, and into the silence stepped Gregory Davenport himself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that gleamed under the chandelier light. Gregory was more than a billionaire. He was a man whose presence could bend a room. The orchestra stopped mid-note. The servers froze in place. Every guest instinctively straightened, as though standing in judgment. His sharp eyes scanned the scene in seconds. Naomi's flushed cheek, Charlotte's raised hand, the horrified circle of witnesses. And with that one sweep of his gaze, he understood what had happened. "Charlotte," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of thunder. "What have you done?" The heiress's hand trembled. For the first time all evening, Charlotte Davenport looked small. Naomi held her ground, her heartbeat racing in her chest, as the man whose empire defined the city turned his attention toward the truth hanging in the silence. The gala, once a spectacle of wealth and glamour, had become something else entirely, a reckoning. And Naomi realized this was no longer about a slap, or humiliation, or even dignity alone. It was about something larger. The power to remind the world that no matter how high privilege builds its walls, justice has a way of finding its way in. The room was so silent that even the chandeliers seemed to stop trembling. Gregory Davenport's voice hung in the air, low and resonant, demanding an answer his daughter wasn't ready to give. Charlotte's hand lowered slowly, her knuckles trembling as she realized the scope of what had just happened. For years she had lived untouched by consequence. Her father's empire had shielded her, excused her arrogance, funded her indulgences, but now his piercing eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time, the heiress felt the weight of shame press against her skin. "Father," she stammered, forcing out a brittle laugh, as though the moment could be brushed aside like a spilled drink. It was nothing. Just a misunderstanding with the staff. "She was out of place and I—" "Stop!" Gregory's single word cracked like a whip. The laugh died in Charlotte's throat. She stood frozen, her friends shrinking into the corners of the ballroom, their jeweled bracelets suddenly too heavy on their wrists. Naomi's cheek still burned, but she didn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to slip away, to escape the heat of the spectacle. Yet something deeper, her pride, her mother's lessons, her own quiet fire, rooted her to the marble floor. She would not be erased. Not this time. Gregory stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the floor, each sound echoing with authority. He turned to Naomi first, his sharp gaze softening ever so slightly as he took in the strength with which she held herself. "What is your name?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, her throat dry, but her voice emerged steady. "Naomi Carter, sir, junior curator for the exhibition." Gregory gave a curt nod, then turned his attention back to his daughter. "Charlotte Davenport," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with disappointment. "You struck a guest in front of this entire room." "She isn't a guest." Charlotte's protest burst out, her face flushed with fury. "She's staff, father." She shouldn't have been standing there like she belonged. Everyone saw it. Gregory's gaze darkened, and the ballroom seemed to shiver with the weight of it. "And what did you see, Naomi?" he asked, turning back toward her. Naomi's pulse quickened. Every pair of eyes in the room bore into her, waiting, judging, measuring her worth by how she would answer. She swallowed hard, but when she spoke, her voice rang out clear, carrying across the still air. "I saw a woman who believes her name makes her greater than others," Naomi said, her words deliberate, her eyes locked on Gregory's. "I saw a hand raised to remind me I don't belong, but I will not shrink, because I do belong here, just as much as anyone." A ripple spread through the guests. Some lowered their eyes in shame, others whispered behind their jeweled hands. But there was no denying the power in Naomi's voice. It was the kind of truth that cracked foundations. Gregory studied her, the faintest glimmer of respect flickering in his gaze. Then he turned sharply toward Charlotte, his voice colder than winter steel. "Is this the legacy you think I built for you? Wealth without wisdom, power without restraint, influence without compassion. If so, then I have failed you as a father." Charlotte's eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The orchestra stood frozen. Servers balanced trays that trembled in their hands. Guests shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty to the Davenport name and the moral weight of what they had witnessed. For once, no one dared to protect Charlotte with silence. Gregory exhaled a slow, deliberate breath that carried the burden of disappointment. "Apologize," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. Charlotte's lips parted, her pride battling her fear. Her friends, sensing the danger of standing too close, melted into the crowd, leaving her exposed. Finally, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "I'm sorry." But Gregory's eyes narrowed. "Louder!" Charlotte swallowed hard, her throat tight. She turned reluctantly to Naomi, her voice breaking. I apologize." The words were fragile, stripped of sincerity. But the room heard them all the same. Naomi didn't bow her head, didn't accept the apology with meekness. Instead, she stood tall, her silence louder than Charlotte's forced contrition. Murmurs rippled through the guests. This was not the spectacle they had come for. They had expected champagne toasts, not public reckonings. Yet here they were, witnessing the Davenport patriarch dismantle his daughter's arrogance in front of the city's most powerful figures. Naomi's chest rose and fell, her heart pounding as she tried to absorb what was happening. For years she had worked quietly, hoping her diligence would be enough to earn her respect in places like this. And tonight she had been humiliated before hundreds, but also seen. Truly seen. Gregory turned back to her, his voice lowering. "You stood your ground, Miss Carter. That takes courage. More courage than most in this room will ever know." Naomi met his gaze, unsure how to respond. She hadn't spoken out for applause or recognition. She had spoken because silence would have been surrender. Charlotte stood trembling, her face pale. For the first time in her life, she was not shielded by her father's name. The hand that had once risen so quickly now hung limp at her side. The room she once dominated with laughter and cruelty no longer belonged to her. Gregory straightened, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "The gala will continue," he said firmly. "But let it continue with respect. If anyone cannot abide by that, you may leave now." Not a single guest moved. The orchestra picked up a trembling note, slowly weaving music back into the air. Conversations resumed, quieter, more cautious than before. But the room had changed. The air itself carried the weight of what had transpired. Naomi stepped back, her hand brushing the edge of the art display she had been tending. She thought of her mother's words. "Dignity is something no one can take from you." Tonight she had proven those words true. Even in the face of cruelty, she had held fast. And though Charlotte Davenport's slap had silenced the room, it was Naomi's words that had left the deepest mark. The music drifted back into the air, but it could not erase the memory of what had just unfolded. The gala carried on, but the heartbeat of the night had shifted. Every step, every whisper, every clink of glass was weighed down by what the guests had witnessed. For once, wealth and diamonds did not glitter brighter than truth. Naomi remained by the exhibition, her hand steadying the pedestal that held the featured painting. Her cheek still throbbed where Charlotte's hand had struck, but inside her a fire burned stronger than pain. She had not been silenced. She had not been erased. People began to drift toward her, hesitant at first. A woman in a silver gown approached, her voice hushed but sincere. "That was brave," she said. Her eyes filled with something Naomi rarely saw in rooms like this: respect. Others followed, nodding, offering quiet words. Not everyone, of course. Some still cast wary glances, afraid to associate too closely with her. But for Naomi, the acknowledgement, however small, was enough. Across the room, Charlotte stood isolated, her friends keeping their distance. Their loyalty dissolved in the acid of shame. Her father's words had struck deeper than Naomi's defiance. For the first time, the heiress was not the center of adoration but the object of pity, even scorn. Her apology, thin as glass, had not redeemed her. It had exposed her. Gregory Davenport lingered near the edges of the crowd, his sharp eyes observing everything. Business titans, political leaders, and socialites alike watched him for cues, but tonight he gave them none. Instead, he approached Naomi once more, his voice low so only she could hear. "You reminded my daughter and everyone here of something they had forgotten," he said. "That dignity is not bought. It is earned." Naomi looked at him, unsure how to respond. She was wary of men like Gregory Davenport, men whose power could shift lives with a single decision. Yet in his words she sensed sincerity, an acknowledgement of something deeper than wealth. "I only spoke the truth," Naomi said quietly. "And that," Gregory replied, "is rarer than any diamond in this room." He studied her for a long moment, then continued. "I will not insult you with empty gestures tonight, but I will tell you this, the work you do here, it matters. And the way you carried yourself tonight, it will not be forgotten." Before Naomi could respond, Gregory turned and walked away, his presence swallowed by a cluster of investors eager to capture his attention. The night stretched on, but Naomi felt a strange calm settle over her. She had walked into the gala as a junior curator, nearly invisible in the shadows of wealth. Now, though she carried the sting of humiliation on her cheek, she also carried something greater, the undeniable truth that her voice mattered. When the final notes of the orchestra faded and the last guests trickled out, Naomi remained behind to oversee the closing of the exhibition. The halls, once alive with chatter, were quiet now. She traced her fingers lightly over the frames of the paintings, ensuring each was secure, each accounted for. It was her duty, her responsibility, and she performed it with the same pride as she had at the start of the evening. But something inside her had changed. Later, as she stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretched before her in lights and shadows. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the chill soothe her burning cheek. A voice inside her whispered that tonight was not an end, but a beginning. In the weeks that followed, whispers of the gala spread across social circles like wildfire. The story of the heiress who slapped a young black woman, and the reckoning that followed, became impossible to bury. The tabloids tried to soften the tale, but the truth slipped through, told in hushed tones at dinner tables, repeated in boardrooms, carried by those who had witnessed it firsthand. Naomi's name began to surface in unexpected places. Colleagues at the museum where she worked looked at her differently, with admiration rather than dismissal. An email arrived from a foundation that had heard of her courage, offering her a fellowship to further her curatorial career. Doors that had long been locked began to creak open, not because of pity, but because she had shown the world she could not be ignored. As for Charlotte, the shine of her name dulled. Invitations that once flooded her mailbox dwindled. Friends grew scarce, unwilling to be tied to her tarnished reputation. For the first time, she faced the emptiness her privilege had shielded. Her from a loneliness born not of circumstance, but of her own choices. Gregory, true to his word, did not let the night slip into silence. Behind closed doors, he pushed his daughter to reckon with her arrogance. Whether it was guilt, shame, or the quiet respect Naomi had earned in his eyes, he made certain Charlotte knew her actions had consequences. And though change for someone like Charlotte would not come easily, the first cracks had appeared in her unyielding facade. Naomi, however, did not dwell on the heiress or her downfall. She poured herself into her work, into the art that told stories of resilience, of struggle, of beauty that refused to be diminished. She found strength in the canvas and the sculpture, in the history preserved by hands long gone. One evening, months later, she stood alone in a gallery, overseeing a new exhibition. The lights bathed the artwork in a soft glow, and as she adjusted one final frame, she caught her reflection in the glass. For a moment she saw not just herself, but every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong, every man who had been struck down by arrogance, every voice that had been silenced by power. And she smiled, because she knew the truth. Belonging is not granted by wealth or power. It is claimed by standing tall when others try to make you small. Naomi Carter had claimed it, and no slap, no heiress, no arrogance could take it away. The gala would be remembered not for its chandeliers, nor its champagne, nor even the billions it paraded. It would be remembered for the night a young black woman stood her ground, and dignity silenced privilege. And that, more than any jewel in the Davenport Empire, was priceless.